Hello, Namaskar, Vanakkam. My name is Sudhir Sahasranaman and you're watching Study with Sudhir. Right at the outset, let me tell you that if my energy levels are a little low, it's because I'm recording this particular video. I'm starting to record this video at approximately 10:20 in the night. That's because um, of a personal medical emergency. My mother-in-law has been in hospital, um, fracture. She's 86 years old. She fell and suffered a fracture. So um, if my energy levels are a little low, please understand the reason. Okay. Uh, this particular chapter is a rather complex one. It is complex mainly because when I was reading it, I was feeling very exasperated at the style that Charles Lamb had followed. That's because the sentences are inordinately long. This particular essay was published somewhere in the early 1820s. Okay, somewhere in the early 1820s. So you are talking about something which was published 200 years ago. I really do not understand what relevance this kind of, though it, in terms of theme, in terms of subject, it is very good. But in terms of treatment, in terms of the style of writing, I find it not very modern in that sense, because now no one writes these kind of sentences which run into so many lines. Nevertheless, since it's part of our syllabus, we got to do it. So I would request you to definitely read the boxes on the left hand side of your textbook, page number 20, in which you are told about Charles Lamb, and then you are also told about the story, what exactly it is. It is considered one of Charles Lamb's most poignant, as in a very moving kind of a story. If you are able to navigate through the long sentences, that is, its prose at that time was considered very beautiful. The emotion is very deep. That is something which we will talk about in detail while I'm discussing this. Also, it is very important to note that he actually wrote with the pseudonym of Elia, okay, Elia, who was one of his colleagues when he was working. And we come to know of this right at the end of the essay. Okay, so before we start, I just want to point out a couple of facts and then we will start, and I will do line by line explanation. I'll try to keep it simple because I don't want to add to the complexity of this particular essay. So let's first understand what exactly does this word reverie mean. Now, reverie essentially means a state of daydreaming, right? A state of being lost in one's own thoughts. And that's what exactly this essay is all about. Please keep writing whatever I'm telling you, because all this you would need to include in your 5-mark and 10-mark questions, answers. Okay, so this entire essay is structured like a monologue, which is a bit dreamlike, because he's talking about things which are part of his imagination, which actually did not exist in reality. Okay, so please remember that. It is deeply autobiographical because he's talking about his own life, even though it is imaginary in many of the contents. And it's an essay which deals with the subject of loss. The central emotion, the emotion that is central to this particular essay, is that of pathos, a certain degree of sadness. And that is something which we are left with as we end the essay. It's essentially 4 big paragraphs. Okay, and that's what we are going to deal with. The initial thing is of a very domestic scene, that here is a person who is talking to his children and telling them about their great grandparent. So that's how it starts. So it starts with as a very cozy domestic scene, but as we get into it, we realize that he's remembering a lot of people who were once part of his life, right, and who seem to have left a very deep impact on his mind and heart. Okay, so let's get started. Children love to listen to stories about their elders when they were children, to stretch their imagination to the conception of a traditionary great uncle or granddame whom they never saw. So let me do the first sentence. As I said, I will do it sentence by sentence. So the meaning of the first sentence is that children are always fascinated by hearing stories of their parents or the childhood of their elders. Oh, how was my father as a child? what games did he play, how was he good at studies. They would go and ask the grandparent, tell us about my father or tell us about my mother. Children are always interested and very inquisitive about these kind of details, because when they listen to stories about the childhood of someone dear to them, it allows them to imagine people and the times that they have never witnessed. Obviously, they have never seen their father as a child, so it allows them to kind of imagine. In fact, a very interesting AI developed photograph my daughter Tejaswini made of my father as he's 88 years old, touchwood, uh, God bless him. And when he was in his early 30s, okay, very handsome looking man. So she had created a photograph of her grandfather as he is now, right now, at the age of 88, with his 30-year early 30, he must have been 31, 32 at that time, in his attempt, dashing, wearing a tie and all that. And my father was very amused to see that, and very good, because the present self putting his arm around the younger self, and the younger self also putting his arm around the older self. Anyway, so children are always very fascinated about this, seeing, hearing tales about their elders' childhood, because it allows them to imagine people in that kind of an era. Grandame is an archaic and very old-fashioned word for grandmother, or let's say an old woman. Okay, it can be used for both. The next line: it was in this spirit that my little ones crept about me the other evening to hear about their great grandmother Field, who lived in a great house in Norfolk. So, Charles Lamb describes his children gathering about him, creeping about him, crept about him, is essentially means that they gathered around him, but it has a slightly negative, not negative, but almost as if they come slowly towards him. So they gathered around him, eager to hear about their ancestor, Mrs. Field, who lived in a grand house much larger than their own house. Norfolk is a county in the eastern part of England, which borders the North Sea in terms of geographical location, I am telling you. So she lived in a house which was 100 times bigger than in which they and Papa, that is Charles Lamb, lived, which had been the scene, so at least it was generally believed in that part of the country, of the tragic incidents which had lately become familiar with from the ballad of the children in the wood. My God, just imagine, this starts here and goes on till here. Oof. So what is being said is that the house is connected with the tragic story. I'm going slow so that you can note this down. The house in which they're talking about is connected with the tragic story from the ballad, which is called The Children of the Wood, which was a tale which very well known in that area at that time. Charles Lamb notes that children have heard this sad story before. Now, what exactly is the story about this Children of the Lamb? Children in the Wood. Children in the Wood essentially is a ballad. Okay, it's essentially is a ballad. The basic story is that after their parents' death, two young children are entrusted to their uncle. Okay, he's supposed to take care of them, but he plots to have them killed so that he can inherit the property of their parents. Okay, so he's a greedy uncle, but the people he employs to get them killed, the ruffians, the gundas, who he employs to get them killed, they leave them, abandon them in the forest area, where they eventually die. The children eventually die and are covered with leaves by birds, while the wicked uncle who wanted to get them killed, he suffers a series of misfortunes as punishment for his greed and for the evil act that he wanted to commit, that he ordered should be committed. So the events of the ballad, Children in the Wood, were beautifully carved. Okay, certain it is that the whole story of the children and their cruel uncle was to be seen fairly carved out in wood upon the chimney piece of the great hall. So the events of this particular ballad, this particular story, were beautifully carved, okay, on the mantelpiece of the great hall, right, on the chimney piece, which is the chimney piece is the thing which leads to the chimney. The entire mantelpiece, it had been drawn in great detail. Even the birds said to cover the dead children, with the leaves. But a wealthy new owner subsequently, till a foolish rich person Okay, till a foolish rich person, a wealthy new person, he replaced this artifact, this meaningful artifact in which the entire story had been made, with a modern storyless marble. He made pulled down a marble to set up a marble, one of modern invention. In instead means instead in its place, with no story upon it. So he replaced it with a marble which had no story on it, and that is something which Charles Lamb describes as, he doesn't kind of approve of it. He thinks that it is absolutely thoughtless kind of a decision taken by this foolish rich person, and that's why he calls it foolish. Now, the robin redbreast. Okay, let me just highlight this particular word. Robin redbreasts are birds that show compassion, they show mercy, they show sympathy to the abandoned children. And after the children die of starvation inside the forest, the robins are a kind of bird. They cover the bodies with leaves as a symbolic burial, an act of kindness that is in sharp contrast to what their wicked uncle had sought to do. Here Alice put, now let's come here. Here Alice put out one of her dead mother's looks too tender to be called upbraiding. Now at this point in time, when she heard all this, Alice, who is one of the children, she looks at the father, Charles Lamb, with an expression full of gentle reproach, as though, oh, kind of a thing, or of sympathy, which reminds Charles Lamb of her mother, right? That this is the same expression that her mother also would have. And upbraiding is an act of scolding. So it is not an expression which can be seen to be as though she's scolding Charles Lamb. No, she's not doing anything of the sort. So it is something, it is an expression of sympathy, gentle reproaching, like that, but it is not scolding, right? It's not harsh scolding. You can say mild scolding, or censuring someone severely, kind of thing. Is it like that? So you're not completely in approval, but you're not severely scolding either. It's gentle kind of scolding. Then I went on to say how religious and how good their great grandmother Field was, how beloved and respected by everybody, though she was not indeed the mistress of this great house. So now he goes on to say that Lamb praises Mrs. Field, that is the great grandmother, all her virtues, that her goodness, that she was good, she was very pious, and she kind of was respected by everybody. So he kind of talks about the different positive virtues, the virtues that Mrs. Field had. But the caretaker of the house, she was not the mistress of this great house. She was only in charge of it, because the caretaker of the house, who committed to her by the owner, who preferred living in a newer and more fashionable mansion. So the owner lived in a more fashionable mansion, and he had given it to a caretaker. So the caretaker of the house, she was only the caretaker of the house, not the owner of the house, but the owner of the house lived in a fashionable mansion somewhere nearby. Okay. Now, I'm getting confused with these long lines without any full stop. Okay, had purchased somewhere in an adjoining county, in a nearby county, but she lived in it in a manner as if it had been on her own. So Mrs. Field, what she did was she maintained the house as if it were her own. There was a sense of association. There was a sense of ownership, not in a negative way, in the sense she would take good care of that particular house, even though she was only a caretaker. She was not the owner. Okay. But she lived in a manner as if it had been her own, and kept up the dignity of the great house in a sort while she lived. So until her death, while she lived means until her death, she maintained the beauty and the dignity of this house, which afterward came to decay. But after she died, it kind of started decaying. It fell into disrepair. It was not being maintained very well, and was nearly pulled down. It was almost pulled down, and all its old ornaments stripped and carried away to its owner's other house. So all the good things about the house were taken away to the owner's other house in the neighboring county, where they were set up, and looked as awkward as if someone were to carry away the old tombs they had seen lately at the abbey. So when these things from this particular house were put there, and they looked very out of place, they looked very odd out there, they looked very awkward. And now he's making this comparison. What is he comparing it with? He's comparing it with moving ancient tombs to a gaudy modern tomb, right? So the tombs, if you move it to a home, right? And that's what it looked like. And obviously, he was very disapproving of it. It seemed very tasteless. It seemed very disrespectful. And stick them in Lady C's tawdry gilt. Gilt is golden drawing room, right? The drawing room looks very fashionable and this thing, but these are the things which have been taken away from another house, not which had fallen into the state of disrepair and had been put out here. Okay. Here, John smiled as much to say that would be foolish indeed. At this time, John, who is Lamb's son, Alice, and John. So John smiles, agreeing with the father that such careless moving of the past treasures is indeed a foolish thing to do. With this, we come, feeling very tired. We come to the end of the first paragraph. Okay, as I told you, I really did not enjoy doing this. And then I told how, preparing for this. And then I told how when she came to die, her funeral was attended by a concourse of all the poor. So in the first paragraph, we see that there is a lot of nostalgic storytelling about Mrs. Field, the kind of house she lived in, and what happened to the house after she was no more. So it is telling us about 19th century England. As I said, the story was written the essay was written in the early 1820s. And the attitude towards caretakers about houses, etc., is also conveyed in the first paragraph. In the second paragraph, Lamb describes the wide respect his great grandmother commanded. Okay, because her funeral was attended by both the poor and the rich people, the wealthy people, showing that her kindness and her pious nature had affected and had touched many people, both poor as well as rich, the entire community. Okay, concourse is a large open space in a public building. Okay, so of the gentry means the upper class of the neighborhood for many miles round, to show their respect for her memory because she had been such a good and religious woman. Okay, so that was the reason why people respected her and turned up for her funeral. So good indeed that she knew all the psaltery by heart, and a great part of the Testament. So it shows that psaltery and the Testament are essentially the religious Christian books. So she knew all of that. So basically, to tell us that she was exceptionally religious by nature, right? So her devotion is emphasized after she is no more. Okay. Now, here little Alice spread her hands. So now little Alice spreads her hands means Lamb observes that his daughter expresses in a particular way by spreading her hands, almost as if she's quite amazed at the kind of respect her father's great grandmother got after she was no more. Also, the fact that she was so devoted that she knew both the Psalms and the Testament by heart. Okay. Now, where will we? Then I told what a tall, upright, graceful person their great grandmother Field once was. So now he goes on to describe his great grandmother even more. Okay. Their great grandmother, that is his grandmother. I'm getting confused. The children's great grandmother, his grandmother. I'm sorry for that. Okay. So then I told what a tall, upright, graceful person their great grandmother Field once was, and how in her youth she was esteemed the best dancer. So that is another aspect that we are being told, that Mrs. Field, when she was young, was a very good dancer. She was very graceful and she was admired as one of the finest dancers of her county. Okay. And Alice involuntarily, as a result of which Alice's little right foot played an involuntary movement. So upon listening to this, Alice moves her feet almost in a very dance-like movement. Involuntary means she doesn't realize that she's doing that. Till upon my looking grave, it desisted. Now Lamb looks at it and he seems to disapprove of that. He gives a serious look, and that's when she stops. That's when she realizes that she is making that kind of an involuntary movement. The best dancer, I was saying, in the county till a cruel disease called a cancer came. How sorry, how sad. So her liveliness and her ability to dance very gracefully were reduced, were diminished because of this deadly disease called cancer, which completely bent her body. Okay, it made them stoop. Okay, but it could never bend her good spirits. Okay, it bowed down with pain, but it could never bow down her good spirits or make them stoop. So her spirits were very high, but her body obviously was weakened as a result of the cancer disease. But they were still upright because she was so good and religious. Okay, so different aspects of the great grandmother of the children are being conveyed here. Then I told how she was used to sleep by herself in a lone chamber of the great lone house, and how she believed that an apparition of two infants was to be seen at midnight gliding up and down the great staircase near where she slept. So now we are again going back to the ballad Children in the Wood. So Lamb essentially now shares a family ghost story that Mrs. Fields slept alone. I'm reminded of my grandmother. Okay, in a huge house, she used to live alone. And she said, I'm not scared. In fact, a very funny anecdote I must tell you, that once in the rain or sometime, it was pitch dark and a thief came inside the house to steal something. And my grandmother didn't really have any major ornaments or anything. It will be only a few clothes of hers and really no big money, etc. So he came. You know what my grandmother did? I mean, the brave woman that she was. She passed away at the age of 101, right? I remember writing a tribute to her saying that my grandmother is a Sachin Tendulkar. She engaged in a conversation with the burglar, and the two kept on talking with each other, and he was telling stories about what he was going through, and she gave him some money, some clothes, etc. for his children, and he went away, so when I'm thinking of it, I find it, amazing. My grandmother was a great woman. Her name was Lakshmi. Then I told how she was used to sleeping by herself in a lone chamber of the great lone house. So she used to be very unafraid, and she used to live alone in a big house, and sometimes believing she sometimes saw the ghosts of the two children on the stairs. So that is the apparition. The word means the ghosts of the two infants. She felt no fear, but she was not scared, trusting their innocence, right? That no harm would be caused to her. But Lamb, by contrast, admits that he was always nervous. That's what we will learn. Gliding up and down the great staircase near where she slept. But she said those innocents would not do any harm. And how frightened I used to be. Lamb used to be frightened. Though in those days I had my maid to sleep with me because I was never half so good or religious as she. So basically, Lamb is trying to convey the fact that she was so religious actually gave her a lot of inner strength that made her extremely courageous and brave. But since he was not so good and he was not so religious, he would actually get scared, and he never saw the infants that his grandmother, they thought she saw. So he never saw the ghost himself, the infant's ghost. Here, John expanded all his eyebrows and tried to look courageous. So now the son gives a reaction that he mimics, bravado, try to look courageous. Unlike the father, he kind of tries to convey that I am very brave. So it's basically a child's very cute kind of a response. Then I told how good she was to all her grandchildren, having us to the great house in the holidays, where I in particular used to spend many hours by myself. So now Lamb is talking about in the past, talking about the past while he was exploring the grand old house and gardens during the holidays, especially enjoying a lot of these kind of very imaginative kind of activities, right? I used to spend many hours by myself in gazing about the old bust of the 12 Caesars that had been emperors of Rome. So he would spend a lot of time admiring them, looking at them very closely, looking at those ancient statues and wandering around the empty halls, the old marble heads would seem to live again, and I would be turned into marble with them, the vast empty rooms. Okay, just read this, I'll tell you the meaning. Okay, and observing details of faded craftsmanship, because what is essentially happening, the 12 Caesars, you need to know this. 12 Caesars essentially refers to a series of biographies which were written by a Roman historian. Basically talks about the life of Julius Caesar and the first 11 Roman emperors. Okay, Julius Caesar, which you studied in class 10. It tells the story of Julius Caesar and the first 11 Roman emperors, which is why 12 Caesars who had been emperors of Rome. So basically what he's talking about is that he would kind of get lost in thought, and he almost imagines that he was one of those marble emperors himself. So it shows a very vivid imagination of Charles Lamb, and this is an important point because this entire essay is also imaginary and imaginative in nature, right? So the fact that right from his childhood he did have a very vivid imagination, that is a point, and this can come as a question talking about the imaginative virtue of Charles Lamb, his ability to kind of exercise his imagination. Okay. So the empty rooms would have worn out hangings. Now this is the different kind of tapestries which is being spoken about. Fluttering means fluttering in the wind. Fashion gardens, which I had carved oaken panels till the gilding. Gilding means gold, almost rubbed out. Sometimes in the spacious old-fashioned gardens, which I had almost to myself. So it was a pretty desolate kind of place, not anyone else around. Unless when now and then a solitary garden man would cross me, occasionally a gardener would be seen, and how the nectarines and peaches hung upon the walls, and without my ever offering to pluck them because they were forbidden fruit unless now and then. So now what he's talking about is that instead of indulging in eating the fruit, what Charles Lamb did or preferred to do was to enjoy the simple beauty and the delights, the sensory delights, the smell, etc., or touching of the gardens. He used to enjoy looking around the gardens, the sense of sight, the sense of smell, etc. So he enjoyed the small wonders. For example, picking up the berries, the lying in the grass, or smelling the flowers. So different senses he's actually exercising: the sense of sight, the sense of touch, the sense of smell, the sense of taste, everything, right? Observing the fish, warming himself out there. And basically, he valued these pleasures which were very simple in nature. He's kind of enjoying the nature, in the beauty of nature in the gardens. And it highlights his rather dreamy, imaginative, and a slightly reflective kind of a personality, that he's able to kind of think of all these different kinds of aspects: the red berries, the apples, the fresh grass, the smell of the garden, the basking in the orangery, talking about the oranges and the limes. And oh God, you feel very lost, frankly. And watching the dace. Now, dace is what? Okay, dace is essentially a freshwater fish, often found in European rivers and streams. It has a very slender body with a silvery kind of a color, and it is a very popular fish when anglers go for fishing. They like to catch the dace. So he's talking about all these different elements which are there in the garden, which he's able to enjoy seeing, smelling, tasting, touching, everything, right? Frisking against me is the thing of touching. I had more pleasure in this busy idle diversion than in the sweet flavors of peaches, nectarines, oranges, and such common baits of children. So he would actually enjoy looking at each one of them, especially the fish, etc. So the passage essentially conveys, the second paragraph essentially talks about memory. It talks about tradition. It talks about the goodness, the faith, the kind of effect it had on his grandmother, and the kind of reception she got after she was no more. And he basically also talks about the value of enjoying the sights and sound, what you can see around you. So in that detailed garden, in that grand house. So he's talking about England as it existed then in the 19th century. Okay. The third paragraph. Here, John slyly deposited back upon the plate a bunch of grapes which, not unobserved by Alice, he had mediated dividing with her, and both seemed willing to relinquish them for the present as irrelevant. So now he's back in the present and he's observing what John and Alice are doing. So what John, who is Lamb's son, has done is to quietly put back the grapes he was about to share with Alice, and both children agree through their actions that food is not important at this particular moment in time, as they are more engrossed in the storytelling of their father. They're more interested in listening to their father instead of eating those grapes. So this kind of a slight movement happens between John and Alice, right? Then in a somewhat more heightened tone, I told how through their great grandmother field loved all her grandchildren, yet in an especial manner, she might be said to love her uncle, John L., because he was so handsome and spirited a youth. So now another character is introduced, who is the uncle, John L. Okay, so Lamb shifts to another part of the story. He describes how their uncle John, unlike his siblings, was loved more by Mrs. Field for his very lively spirit and charm. So he was a favorite as far as Mrs. Field, that is the grandmother, was concerned. Now, what would John do? So he would be kind of, he was handsome. He was a very spirited kind of a personality. He was a king to the rest of us, so that the others would kind of, look up to his personality. And instead of mopping around in solitary corners like some of us, maybe like Lamb, he would not kind of be alone. And mopping around means, being very sad and just, just spending here and there, and generally be an introvert and not being a very exuberant kind of a child. Mopping is also used for weeping, okay, of having a very weepy kind of a personality. He would mount the most mettlesome horse he could get. So he was used to riding horses. Okay, mettlesome is an adjective that describes a person, in this case a horse, as full of mettle means having a very spirited kind of, having a lot of courageous kind of a character, the horse. Okay, so he would ride the energetic horse, and he would go make it run over the country in a morning and join the hunters, and he would go hunting. So it basically shows a more spirited kind of a personality. It shows a very vibrant kind of a character, and it shows a zest for life, that he likes to enjoy life. And he's in sharp contrast to Charles Lamb, who is much more of a keeping to himself kind of a personality. So the other question that can be asked to you in the exam is to contrast John L. with Charles Lamb. Okay, so please make a note of this as well. So where were we? So, but he had too much spirit to be always pent up within their boundaries. Unlike Charles Lamb, pent up means, being confined. And how their uncle grew up to man's estate, as brave as he was handsome, to the admiration of everybody, but of their great grandmother Field most especially. So he was a favorite as far as the grandmother, Mrs. Field, their grandmother, John L.'s grandmother, Mrs. Field, was concerned. But at the same time, okay, how he used to carry me upon his back when I was a lame-footed boy. Okay, so John uncle matured, retaining his courage and good looks. He cared for Lamb. So he had a affectionate relationship with Charles Lamb, because Charles Lamb had a foot injury as a child, and he would carry him over long distances. And that demonstrates what? It demonstrates both his physical strength, that he was able to carry Charles Lamb as a child. Also, it kind of reflects his compassionate nature, that he was kind-hearted, that he would care for this boy who was having an injury in the foot. Yeah. And how, when he died, though he had not been dead an hour, it seemed as if he had died a great while ago. So now he talks about when he died, it looked as though he had died for a long time. Such a distance there is betwixt between life and death. And how I bore his death, as I thought pretty well at first, but afterward it haunted and haunted me. And though I did not cry or take it to heart as some do, and as I think he would have done if I had died. So he kind of, initially, Charles Lamb took his death pretty okay, but later on, it kind of haunted him. He kind of felt bad about him. So you realize that the roles are reversed. Earlier in childhood, it is John L. who is taking care of Charles Lamb, but later on, it is Charles Lamb who is feeling bad for John L. And he admits that he wasn't always as patient or considerate to John in his suffering as John had been to him, right? He could have done better, is the feeling that he gets now, right? I missed his kindness and I missed his crossness, and I wished him to be alive again, because he wants to make amends for that, right? So he notes that immediately after his uncle's death, it felt like, John had gone for a long time, emphasizing the great divide between life and death in rather emotional terms. And he recalls trying to cope, that he did not express grief very openly, unlike his uncle who would have felt if in case Lamb had passed away. But gradually he kind of gets used to the absence of John L. And realizing that he had actually loved John a lot, but he had never kind of expressed it in so many words, and how constant uh, John Uncle's presence had been, right? So Lamb essentially misses not only John's kindness, but also their quarrels. Crossness is referring to their arguments or their difference of opinion, preferring those tensions to the uncle's permanent absence, which is why he says, I wished him to be alive again, to be quarreling with him. We quarrel sometimes rather than not to have him again. So he missed the fact that he was gone forever. And he was obviously feeling very uneasy about that, as he, their poor uncle, must have been when the doctor took off his limb, right? So the John must have suffered during his medical troubles, took off his limb, the loss of a limb, and it conveys a deep sense of empathy and regret. He's regretting. There's a lot of regret in Charles Lamb's tone as he talks about John L. Okay. So this paragraph, if you realize, it's talking a lot about, it's very personal. It's a very emotional kind of narrative. It talks about, it explores human relationships, the relationship between John L. and Charles Lamb. Most importantly, it talks about the theme of loss. Now, the theme of loss is another definite 10-mark question that can be asked, because we are talking about the loss of one Mrs. Field. We are talking about the loss of John L., right? So you will need to combine both and talk about how the theme of loss has been dealt with in this particular essay by Charles Lamb, right? So basically, he's talking about nostalgia for John L., and he combines it with regret after he's no more. The fact that he would prefer to quarrel with him than not to have him permanently ever, because he realizes that there was this gap that was there and he wished it was not there. So he's kind of talking about the relationship and the gaps in the relationship that the two had. So it explores this cycle of care between the two of them as the roles reverse over time. Earlier, John was taking care of them. Earlier, it was John who needed some kind of care and attention. And the pain of losing someone who had played a role in shaping your personality, in supporting you, right? It's always like that, right? If you lose someone who's extremely near and dear to you, it's like, it's a full stop. It's not a comma. That person, it could be a parent, it could be a grandparent, that person is never going to come back into your life, right? And you feel that, no, oh God, there are so many things I wish I could have told him or her, right? Those things will always remain unsaid, right? There is no closure in that sense, because you feel, oh, I wish I had done this for him. I wish I had done this for her. She'd asked me for this. I remember, slightly, I mean, a personal story. This was in the year 2020, June. My father-in-law was admitted to hospital. He had a major ailment suddenly, related to the lungs and the heart. And before he was wheeled into the operation theater, he asked my wife, Uma, I want to drink water. And at that time, she couldn't drink water, because she couldn't have made him drink water because he had to go into surgery immediately. And then he never came back. He was 30 days admitted to hospital and he passed away exactly on the 31st day. And she always has that regret, that he asked me for water. And I was not in a position to give him water at that stage. That is the last time he actually spoke to her. So, there is always this kind of gap that remains, which is why it's so very important to be kind to people when you can be. Because, first of all, we never know what another person is going through. We never know. Everybody has a story. So it's always better if you can actually be kind. In fact, only this evening, I was reading about a town in the USA where there is something called a kindness box, okay, where people put kind messages on chits of paper. And anyone who is going through some kind of a problem, they can open it and they can pick up one chit and they can read it, and that would make them feel better, because it would be a message full of kindness, full of support, full of compassion. And which is why, even at the risk of sounding boring, I always tell my children, I always tell my students, be kind. It does not cost anything. It comes free of cost. If you're kind to someone, that person, you are making a huge difference to that person who is going through a problem. And that person will always remember that when I was going through this problem, this person came and said a kind word to me. This person supported me. This person helped me. So that's why I say that. Okay. The last paragraph. Here the children fell a crying and asked if their little mourning which they had on was not for Uncle John, and they looked up and prayed me not to go on about their uncle, but to tell them some stories about their pretty dead mother. Now here Charles Lamb is actually talking about the emotional response of his children, okay, Alice and John, who have begun to cry, okay, they have begun to cry, okay, and they say mourning is the black clothing, okay. So they asked if the little black clothing which they had on was not for Uncle John, okay, is to honor the memory of Uncle John, demonstrating their innocence and their emotional connection to the stories, in the sense that they have listened very carefully to every word said by Charles Lamb. The children are distressed and they plead with the father not to go on telling stories about Uncle John. Instead, they want to be told about their pretty dead mother, the mother who is no more. They want to be told about mother. So they want to seek comfort in the memory of their mother now, because they're feeling rather traumatized, rather anguished by whatever has been told about John L. Okay. Then I told them how for 7 long years, in hope, sometimes in despair, yet persisting ever, I quoted the fair Alice. So Lamb, then he decides to tell about their romance, his romance with their mother. Okay, so he's talking about his own love story, which is a bit bittersweet because his courtship of Alice Winterton. Okay, this is the word, the surname Winterton, which is put as W and N out here. And it was marked by a lot of hope, despair, persistence. So there is a sense of personal longing. And as my children could understand, I explained to them what coyness means being shy, difficulty, and denial meant in maidens. Maidens is a young girl or a young woman. When suddenly turning to Alice, the soul of the first Alice looked out at her eyes with such a reality of representment. Now, what really is me? Now it's getting a little complicated. So Charles Lamb is trying to explain in a very gentle way and in a language which is very child appropriate, that romantic love can involve coyness, hesitation. Coyness, hesitation also, it means shyness and rejection. And this is giving us the hint that his own love story was actually unfulfilled. Okay. And as he looks at his daughter Alice, Lamb is actually suddenly, what the thought that strikes him is that she resembles his beloved who is no more so much. She looks exactly like the woman he loved, who he quoted for 7 long years. The similarity between the two, this Alice and that Alice Winterton, is so intense that it kind of, the boundaries are blurred, okay, between dream and memory, okay. And he cannot tell whether he's seeing his child, that is Alice, or whether he's seeing his former love, Alice Winterton. So he's not able to distinguish between the Alice, the daughter, and Alice, his lady love. That had became in doubt which of them stood before me, or whose that bright hair was. And while I stood gazing, both the children gradually grew fainter to my view, receding and still receding, till nothing at last but two mournful features were seen in the uttermost distance. So the vision, Alice and John, they begin to vanish. He can no longer see them. He can see them vanish in front of his eyes, right? The children's forms, they've just fade away, okay, from Lamb's imagination. So now you realize that the children never existed. He was telling a story perhaps in a vacuum, right? Or perhaps he was just thinking about it, right? So the children never existed. And now he has come back to reality, and that imagination has completely faded away. And what is left are their sad, mournful features. The sad features can be seen in the uttermost distance, because that's the last memory he has of their faces. And they kind of just go away, which without speech strangely impressed upon me the effects of speech. We are not of Alice, nor of thee, nor are we children at all. So now he has put that in direct speech. So immediately he has got awake and he finds himself sitting there, and he's kind of realized that suddenly they are talking, right? Suddenly they are talking and they say that we are not of Alice, we are not children of Alice, we are not your children, right? In fact, we are not children at all, in the sense that those two children, Alice and John, actually did not exist. Okay, the children of Alice call Bartram their father, the person who Alice actually married. Alice, as in the lady love, the person who she married is a person called Bartram. Okay, Bartram, and her children call Bartram as their father, right? We are nothing, less than nothing, and dreams, right? So we are nothing at all. Okay, so we are nothing. We are only what might have been. So it's basically, it is an imagined telepathy of sorts, so it's now he's imagining that the children are talking to him and telling him this, right? That uh, the children, without speaking, communicate a very powerful truth to Charles Lamb, that they are not real, they are not the children of Alice, they are not his children, and Alice's real children are with her husband, who is called Bartram, right? And Lamb's imagined children, Alice and John, are only what might have been. In case if he had been married to Alice Winterton, they might have had children who might have looked like this, and their fate, okay, we are only, okay, must wait upon the tedious shores of Lethe, millions of ages before we have an existence and a name. And immediately awaking, I found myself quieted, seated in my bachelor armchair where I had fallen asleep. So their fate, the fate of the children, is to be forgotten on the shores of Lethe, which is a river. It is a river of forgetfulness. It's a Greek myth. In Greek mythology, river Lethe or Leth is a river of forgetfulness. You can pronounce it either way. It is never to exist or to be named. It's the memory lapse kind of a thing. And Lamb abruptly gets up and he returns to reality, and he finds himself once again a solitary bachelor, because he's a bachelor, right? So in his bachelor armchair where he had fallen asleep, so he had kind of dreamt of all this, with the faithful Bridget unchanged by my side, but John Els or James Elia was gone forever. So he says that only Bridget Mary Lamb, okay, maybe some kind of an pet kind of a thing, was there for his company. The dream was over. The imagined children were lost forever. And also lost is his brother, that is John L., right? And his youthful, dreamy self, that is, he wrote as Elia, right? Uh, was gone forever. So basically, he's realizing that he has nothing, because all that he thought about in his dream, none of them actually existed anymore. John L. was gone, dead. Mrs. Field was gone, dead. And his two children never existed. In fact, they were never born. And the lady he loved also was married to someone else. So basically, the last paragraph is a recognition of Lamb's acceptance of personal loss, of family, of love, and the future that he had once hoped for if he had indeed married Alice. And he can only think of his dream children, who actually do not exist and will never exist. And the invocation of this river of forgetfulness is essentially, is kind of, underlying the central theme, that it is something which never exists. It is something which is in very abstract kind of memory, which is why it comes in his dreams. And he's only grateful for the fact that Bridget is by his side unchanged and gives him company. Okay, so with this, the passage closes the essay with a lot of regret, with talking about memory. And there is a sense of resignation. There is a sense of acceptance of loss, which is a permanent loss. Please remember this. And he's now aware of it, now that he has snapped out of his dream, out of his reverie, which is why it talks about dream children, children who came in his dream, and it was the state of reverie, which is why the title. So if you're asked a question about the title, you need to mainly talk about the fourth paragraph, because that's where that's what lends itself to the title. Okay, I know this is a complex essay. It will probably need you many readings of this particular essay to come to grips with it. As I said, I confess I myself struggle because it's very abstract to be able to explain with the help of some pointers that I had written so that I'm able to talk without getting confused myself. But please read this at least 3 to 4 times. It is not like the other 4 chapters in your textbook in perspectives. This is slightly more complex. So it would need a little more effort for you to come to terms with it. Thank you very much. Tata, bye bye. Namaskar.